When we think of legacy, Nelson Mandela's name naturally comes to mind. A legacy etched in resilience, hope, and the dream of a united South Africa. Through his leadership, Mandela didn't just guide a nation out of the shadows of apartheid. He shaped a vision, a constitution, a roadmap for reconciliation and equality. It wasn't just about dismantling unjust systems, it was about building bridges between deeply divided communities. And honestly, that vision, it feels as relevant today as it did back then. Mandela's aspirations, they were bold. The Constitution drafted under his leadership wasn't just a legal document, it was a declaration of what South Africa could become. A land where equality wasn't theoretical, but tangible, where the scars of racial division could soften into shared purpose. But building a foundation that strong, that takes more than just words on paper. It demands commitments, choices, follow-through. And that's where, things start to get complicated. After Mandela stepped down, the succeeding leaders of South Africa inherited this enormous responsibility. Some, like Thabo Mbeki, worked to steer the country forward, emphasizing economic growth and trying to maintain cohesion. But as times changed, so did political priorities. And cracks began to show. Leadership, it shifted. Politicians started navigating the murky waters of corruption scandals and missed opportunities. Mandela's vision, which had seemed so clear, started to feel, diluted. There's this tension, a widening gap between what was promised and what's been delivered. Corruption has seeped into the fabric of governance, undermining those ideals of fairness and equality. Economic disparity? It's like this persistent echo of the past, a stark reminder of the divisions Mandela sought to heal. And it's not just the policies, it's the perception. Different communities in South Africa see today's challenges through completely different lenses. Some find hope in continuing Mandela's ethos, pushing for reforms that reflect his ideals. Others feel abandoned, by leaders, by promises, by the very system meant to uplift. It makes me wonder, how do you keep a dream alive when reality seems determined to test it? And these disparities, they're not just economic. They live in how people experience the justice system, social services, even how communities interact. It's like Mandela gave us the scaffolding for unity, but we're still figuring out how to climb it, let alone stand steady at the top. To understand where South Africa stands today, we need to dig into the land beneath its feet, quite literally. Land ownership has always been a deeply emotional issue, a symbol of survival, identity, even justice. You see, during apartheid, vast tracts of land were taken from Black South Africans, with laws carving the country into separate territories, and the white minority claiming the majority of usable land. And here we are, nearly 3 decades after apartheid ended, still reckoning with that legacy. In 2017, a government report laid bare the numbers. 72% of privately owned farmland was in the hands of the white minority, who make up less than 10% of the population. Think about that imbalance. For many South Africans, the land isn't just a political issue, it's a wound that never really healed. It's tied to generations of economic exclusion and systemic injustice. Leaders have long talked about addressing this inequality, but talk, only gets you so far. Fast forward to today, and President Cyril Ramaphosa has taken a bold, controversial step. His government recently passed a law that allows land expropriation without compensation. But, and this is key, they emphasize that it's only in the public interest. It's not a free-for-all. The goal, at least on paper, is to right these historical wrongs while respecting constitutional fairness. Land identified for expropriation, the government says it's unproductive or underutilized, and the race of the owner shouldn't factor in. But critics, domestic and international, aren't so sure about that, Take former President Donald Trump, for example. He's claimed, quite dramatically, that South Africa is confiscating land and mistreating landowners, describing the situation as a massive human rights violation. Then there's Elon Musk, a native South African himself, echoing similar concerns, questioning the fairness of the law altogether. Both have painted it as discriminatory and even dangerous. Ramaphosa, though, he's pushed back hard, pointing out that the law is a constitutional tool, not some chaotic land grab. For everyday South Africans, especially those who've felt the sting of landlessness for generations, this law represents hope, a tangible attempt to bridge economic gaps and, maybe, restore a sense of justice. But there's caution, too. Critics warn, and they've brought up Zimbabwe more than once, that meddling with ownership like this could scare investors, even destabilize the agricultural sector. It's the kind of crossroads where no choice feels entirely safe or free of consequence. And yet, what's fairness? Is it giving back what was taken or maintaining the fragile economic stability that keeps everything afloat? For Ramaphosa's government, it's a balancing act, honoring the Constitution while reshaping the promise of a more equitable South Africa. But no matter how you look at it, land isn't just soil and fences. It's history, identity, and, most importantly, future opportunity. When we talk about South Africa today, it's impossible to ignore the global threads influencing its domestic realities. Take the U.S., for instance. Their funding, particularly through PEPFAR, has been a lifeline for South Africa's HIV/AIDS programs. This isn't just numbers on a spreadsheet. This is a tangible human impact. Millions of lives depend on these resources, and hearing threats to cut this funding? Well, it feels like shaking the foundation of a fragile yet critical healthcare system. The thing about threats like these is, they often overlook the broader realities. South Africa isn't just grappling with healthcare, it's battling some of the highest crime rates in the world. Here's where it gets tricky, though. For Black South Africans, crime isn't just a statistic, it's a lived experience shaped by socioeconomic inequities. It's easy for outside observers to focus on high-profile, race-driven narratives. But the reality is, the overwhelming victims of violence are Black. It's like, how can you address crime without addressing the conditions that breed it? Now, this idea of addressing conditions brings us to something deeply complex: foreign intervention. I mean, let's face it, no nation exists in a vacuum. The ethics of intervention, especially from global powers, walk a tightrope between support and overreach. Can you push for justice without compromising a country's autonomy? And when it comes to democracy, who gets to decide what justice looks like? Mandela's vision was always about balancing justice with equity, but here's the twist. What happens when democracy itself is tested by the systems meant to uphold it? South Africa is navigating that tension between honoring a transformative legacy and making hard, present-day decisions in the face of global scrutiny. Ultimately, though, these are questions every democracy faces, aren't they? The line where ideals meet reality. For South Africa, it's a balancing act of monumental proportions between its history and future, justice and practicality, sovereignty and global interdependence. But if Mandela's life taught us anything, it's that progress, while never perfect, is always worth pursuing. And maybe, just maybe, the world watching can learn something too. On that note, thank you for joining me on this journey, diving deep into the layers of South Africa's story. Mandela's legacy, the land beneath its feet, the influence of global powers, it's all interconnected, part of a bigger story. And, I think we can all agree, one that's still being written. Until next time, take care and keep reflecting, because understanding the past is the first step to shaping a better future.